Hello and welcome back to our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 Minutes. My name's Barbara and I'm your host for the next half hour. We focus today on offsetting as part of the carbon journey. We will first touch on an overview of the role of offsets, their part in the overall carbon journey and why they're relevant. And then how can you go about a credible zero carbon journey? How to identify credible carbon offsets. Our guest speaker today is Sean Weaver. Sean's the Executive Director and founder of Ekos. A warm welcome to you, Sean. And a warm welcome to all of you listening in. So today is about navigating the reduction and offset network. And we'll start this journey by just talking about the key stops on that journey, which are reduce, measure, verify, offset, and then you'll get on a loop because that train is not going to stop, but goes via reduce and measure and reduce and measure, on and on. Because yes, we do want to talk about carbon offsets, but it doesn't mean that the journey stops there. It goes back to reduce and measure. So let's have a look at the first stops. And that first stop after reducing and measuring would be the verification interchange. So you come off the measurement line and stop over at the verification interchange. And what you can see here is the verification line is a different line. It's the orange one, because that's quite important. The measurement line goes in a circle, and it can be the same people and the same train helping you on that. But you need to change trains or people to help with the verification, because that needs to be independent. We want to keep those two lines separate. There is a shortcut that you can come to from the measurement line, and that is if you already are on the verification line and, for example, have done an EPD. An EPD is an environmental product declaration of products, and it has the carbon footprint in it. And it's a verified and certified document, which is recognized by a lot of offsetting programs. For example, the Climate Active program in Australia, formerly known as Ekos, the National Carbon Offset System, would recognize a product EPD for the offsetting process. So you don't have to actually do the carbon footprint calculation again and have to get that verified again, but the EPD counts. So that's a shortcut. It's another line, as you can see here. You can come to the offsetting interchange from two directions. You can come from measuring your carbon, getting that verified, or you can come via the EPD stop and swap over at the offsetting interchange. There are quite a few standards that help us to get to those steps, to get to the offsetting stop. Those standards also help you to achieve certification, another stop on the line, which possibly is voluntary stop. You might not have to get off at the certification stop. You can stay on the line and go straight to your offsetting stop. It depends on how you want to communicate later on. And the standards that we have will help to identify what stops you really want to get off that train. Because if you just really want for yourself to know you are a zero carbon or a neutral carbon business or have zero carbon products, you might not need that certificate. You just want to know it for yourself. If you want to communicate externally, though, it is important to use those relevant standards. And those are, for example, ISO 14064 if you talk about organizations, or 14067 if you talk about products. We know all those standards. We've actually co-written some of them. They all give you a greenhouse gas statement, which then can be verified. And there are even standards which say to qualify you to be a verifier. So that's a bit of a map of all the relevant standards. Moving on our carbon journey, we could change trains here. For the next part of the journey, as I said before, it's important to change trains. No one can do it all. And at this stage, I would hand over to Ekos and to Sean Weaver, who can talk a little bit about it. Before I do that, though, there is a question. Do EPDs act as a shortcut to all of the climate active certifications, e.g. organization and events, or just products? EPDs are product declarations, so they are only a shortcut to product certification. And I'm not aware of any other shortcuts that would lead to an easier pathway, but for products, EPDs certainly are that shortcut. And with that, I'll hand over to Sean.
Hi everyone, I'm Sean Weaver from Ekos. We are working very closely with ThinkStep. We focus on the supply of carbon credits as carbon offsets and zero carbon certification, and we also do carbon footprint measurement alongside ThinkStep, especially for small and medium businesses. We work on the supply side of that carbon market, principally through creating a supply chain of carbon credits that are going to cause a range of beneficial co-benefits, especially to landscapes. And in particular, we're interested in helping build climate resilient landscapes through permanent reforestation and also forest protection. Just to reiterate the story that Barbara has been telling you, but using a slightly different lens, the first thing one needs to do on their zero carbon journey is to measure your carbon footprint, and this will help you understand where your emissions are. And as you can see in this image, we've got a set of histograms on the right of the screen, which is an example of a carbon footprint measurement from a New Zealand company. And you'll get a sense of the change in carbon footprint through time. You can also identify which areas in your carbon footprint are your biggest emissions. And this is going to also help you identify where are your low-hanging fruit. So that's why I've got a picture of a fruit tree on the left of the screen, because the low-hanging fruit are those emission reductions that you can achieve at low cost. Economically speaking, emission reductions change in their cost. The marginal cost of these reductions changes after you harvest the low-hanging fruit. The next fruit up the tree gets more expensive. It's still 1 ton of carbon, but it's higher and harder to reach. And so this is why it's important to consider these reductions as much as we can, but then offsetting can then play a role. So looking at the measure, reduce, and offset cycle, you do the measurement, then you identify where your low-hanging fruit are, which is where your biggest emissions might be, and you harvest those fruit by doing those emissions. And some of those emission reductions will be cost negative. Reducing flights, like everybody's doing at the moment, is going to be cost negative typically, because we're just not spending that bill. Whereas some emissions are going to be very expensive to eliminate per ton, and these are the fruit that are higher up on the tree. Now, if we tried to go zero carbon by harvesting all of the emissions fruit on our own tree inside our own business, it's very likely to get prohibitively expensive, and we won't be able to afford to do that while staying in business. So there is a cost threshold in the harvesting of emission reductions in our business. And this is where carbon markets are very handy, because what they enable us to do is to offset our emissions. And what this means is that we can get to zero by doing two things. We can cause beneficial carbon change inside the business, but when we offset, we cause carbon benefits outside the business boundary. So essentially, offsetting is when those emission reductions are too expensive inside your own business, so you're essentially paying somebody else to do them somewhere else. An important point, though, is that the carbon credits that come in the form of offsets, they need to be additional. So that means that these emission reductions wouldn't have happened unless you and people like you bought them, because those projects rely on the carbon financing to enable those activities to take place. I'll have a look at a couple of those activities in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to reflect on this notion of offsetting. And sometimes people say to me and my staff, and I hear it in the community, that some people think that offsetting is a kind of a license to pollute, and zero carbon is just one of these licenses to pollute. In response to that, I would invite you to reflect on, the emissions that we're trying to eliminate, and ask ourselves, well, which ones of those are illegal? And in fact, transportation, electricity, flights and freight and waste, none of these are illegal. So the fact is we've all got those licenses already. So we're talking about businesses that do not have an obligation under any regulatory framework to reduce their emissions or to be zero carbon. This is a voluntary thing. So we've already got those licenses to pollute. And this voluntary undertaking is a good thing. So to voluntarily measure your carbon footprint, that's a good thing. That enables you to voluntarily reduce your emissions in a way which is sensible. And then you can choose to go the extra distance and voluntarily take responsibility for emissions that you couldn't avoid by buying offsets. So it's useful to have this narrative up your sleeve if you're communicating this to other people in your business or other stakeholders that you're communicating with. So how do we do this, and exactly what are offsets? Well, each carbon offset is a ton of carbon dioxide that has either been removed from the atmosphere or it has avoided being put into the atmosphere. Generally, they're called reductions. So they come from projects that have done those reductions. There's different standards that identify or define what offsets are. I've got two examples here. One is the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment, MFE, and the other is the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, ECROA. Their definitions are very similar. The carbon reductions need to be real, measurable, permanent, additional. ECROA has a stronger definition than the Ministry for the Environment guidelines. They need to be independently verified if it's ECROA, using the ECROA definition. They need to be issued as units in a registry, and they need to be cancelled or retired on end use. So, for example, buying carbon credits is not an offset. You've also got to retire or cancel those credits in a registry. Otherwise, you might on-sell them to somebody else. So retirement and cancellation is the process of putting those units to bed, consuming them. So let's have a look at voluntary offsets. Now, I've got an image there of two types of rugby, and you got rugby union and rugby league, and to the untrained eye, they both look like the same game. But of course, to people involved, they're quite different. And it's a bit like this with carbon. You've got the compliance carbon market, which is driven by legal obligations to reduce emissions. And then you've got voluntary carbon markets, which are driven by corporate social responsibility. And so they're different markets. They still use carbon credits, but they've got different drivers. There's also differences between these two markets in the types of carbon credits that are allowed to be consumed by those buyers. And I'll come to that again in a moment. In the compliance carbon market production space, you can produce certain types of carbon credits which can be legitimately used as voluntary carbon offsets. Now, this is an example from the New Zealand setting, although I've also included the ACCUs from Australia that are compliance units. In New Zealand, we have New Zealand units from forestry, and we've got a variation on those called Permanent Forest Sink Initiative units, and Australia have ACCUs. Now, these credits can be used legitimately for voluntary offsetting, but some types of compliant units cannot be legitimately used for carbon offsets, and they include the allocations for trade exposed industries, NZU_EITEs. They include the fisheries allocations and also the pre-1990 forest allocations. They can't be used as legitimate offsets. So it's really good if you're wanting to acquire carbon credits from a compliance jurisdiction to be clear that you're able to legitimately use them for a voluntary offset. New Zealand Ministry for the Environment guidelines have clarified this. They were put out last year. You can find them on the Ministry for the Environment website. Australia will have similar in what used to be called Ekos, which is now called something else, which name escapes me, carbon friendly or something like that. Getting to a bit of detail here, if you're using compliance credits, they have to be treated in a certain way in their cancellation procedure if they're going to be considered legitimate offsets. And for New Zealand forest units, they need to be converted into another type of unit called an assigned amount unit and then cancelled on the registry. And this is called a Kyoto voluntary cancellation workflow. And this is available in New Zealand up until the end of 2023. And post 2023, there will be a new regime because we'll be subject to the Paris Agreement rules by then. And the New Zealand government, at least, has not yet finalised its rules on what that will look like. So I can't share that with you just now. Moving right along, we focus at Ekos in forest carbon credits. And people often ask us, well, if a forest plantation is going to be cut down, how could that possibly be beneficial from a carbon emissions point of view if the forest will be cut down one day? The point is that you're converting land which is not forest into land which becomes forest and then remains forest through the long term. So even if you grow your forest following the curve, and then you harvest in the future, and then you grow again, and you harvest and grow again, and you harvest, your average carbon stocks, which is your dotted line, is going to be higher than a landscape which has no forest on it at all. And it's just that average change in carbon stocks that are the benefit, and they get issued to a project as a one-off at the beginning in the first rotation of a plantation. If you've got a forest project which is growing trees but is not destined to be harvested, then the average carbon stocks just increase through time until that forest reaches its saturation point, and after that point it won't be sequestering carbon and it won't be getting any carbon credits issued. So that's how that works. There's other types of projects which avoid carbon emissions, a little bit like avoiding fossil fuel emissions when you build a wind farm. Here you can do avoided deforestation. We have projects that do this in the Pacific Islands, where the original carbon stocks are a tall forest. If you were to deforest, the carbon stocks will go down very quickly. The landowners of that land would have access to that financial revenue and therefore fund their economic development, and that's good for them, but it's not good for nature. If we were to protect that forest, on the other hand, we would put that forest into long-term protection, and the avoided emissions are turned into carbon credits and sold so that the landowners can sell carbon credits instead of wood and fund their economic development. A variation on that is when the forest is not destined to be clear-cut, but just logged selectively. And so if it were selectively logged, its carbon stock average would go down. But if you avoid that, you keep the carbon stocks at the original level, and this way you can sell carbon credits again instead of wood and earn carbon credits for the protection of your forest, and the volume of credits you get is simply the difference between what is called the baseline carbon stocks, which is what would happen under timber harvesting, and the project carbon stocks, which is what happens under forest protection. So in New Zealand and Australia, there are different opportunities for forest types. This is really focusing on a New Zealand example. You can have plantation softwoods, which are pine trees. You can have hardwoods. This is a picture of eucalypts. Hardwoods are leafy trees that have got, any tree with a leaf and a flower is a hardwood. Any tree with a pine needle is a softwood. And then, of course, you've also got native forests. We've got a bunch of projects happening throughout New Zealand, and we also work in the Pacific Islands. Now, I mentioned that there are different types of voluntary carbon credit coming out of the voluntary carbon market. Remember, the two types are rugby union, rugby league. The voluntary market not only is voluntary buyers, but it can also have voluntary sellers that are selling carbon credits through the voluntary carbon market system. Now, the voluntary carbon market system is a rapidly growing international sector, and it's determined by different voluntary standards. You've got down the bottom of the image there the verified carbon standard globally, which has the biggest portion of market share. The gold standard you may have heard of, Plan Vivo standard, is kind of a fair trade type standard, and there's a few other standards there. You can do different activity types to create your carbon credits: chemical industrial processes, energy efficiency and fuel switching, renewable energy instead of fossil fuel energy, household devices like cook stoves. The largest subsector in the voluntary market production is forestry and land use that you can see there in the middle. We at Ekos have a number of projects in operation in the Pacific Islands that function in the voluntary market. We have a project in Fiji, one in Vanuatu, another one in development, and 4 of them in development in the Solomon Islands. Our Vanuatu project last year won the UN Equator Award for Innovation in Community Sustainability, and Ekos won the Restorative Innovation Award for the New Zealand Sustainable Business Network, just to show that our work is operating at a high level. Carbon insetting is worth talking about here briefly. Insetting is different to offsetting, because insetting means you're growing your own carbon credits from within your own supply chain. Now, that either means that you own your own carbon project or you joint venture with somebody. And what this means is that you can acquire your own carbon credits at cost rather than, say, future carbon market prices. Now, if you're a large corporate and you want to be voluntarily zero carbon for the long game, then you're going to need to commit to accessing carbon credits through the long term. Now, the tea leaves suggest to me that carbon pricing is going to go up through time, especially as countries head towards the compliance phase of the Paris Agreement from 2030. That's going to put a lot of pressure on budgets. If you have your own supply chain of carbon credits, you can acquire them at cost rather than at market prices. So it's worth considering. So that means an additional investment yourself to create that carbon credit supply chain to get to zero. You generate long-term security of supply. You have control over the provenance of your carbon credits. You're also insulated from future carbon prices, and you also own an asset which you can potentially divest of later. It also allows you to, when I talk about the provenance of the carbon credits, to pump your carbon projects full of co-benefits. Ekos specializes in maximizing the co-benefits in our carbon credit supply chain. We try to maximize the sustainable land management and climate resilience benefits, the biodiversity benefits, and the community benefits, so that we can tick as many of the sustainable development goal boxes as we can per project and produce and deliver single malt top shelf carbon. Thanks for listening, and we'll take some questions if we have time.
Thank you, Sean. We've got a couple of questions for you. There was a question about the situation in Australia, and that actually is the same as in New Zealand. So for ACCUs, you also need to match them with an AAU, and they are called Kyoto ACCUs. One of the questions for Sean was, what is the difference between cancelling and retiring?
Very good question. Now, in the compliance universe, the word retirement means that you have surrendered your carbon credits to the jurisdiction that you have an obligation to, and that's a unit retirement. In the voluntary carbon market, they use the word retirement to signal I've consumed those credits against a carbon offsetting claim. If we're using compliance carbon credits as a voluntary buyer, we can't use the word retirement because we don't have a compliance obligation under any jurisdiction. And so instead, if we're using compliance carbon credits, we do a cancellation. Both retirement and cancellation are essentially the action that puts those carbon credits to bed, so they cannot be bought or sold or transferred to anyone else. They've essentially been consumed. So it's a wee bit like in a rice commodity trading, eventually that rice is going to get eaten by somebody, and it can no longer be traded. That's how carbon credits are eaten. They're retired in a compliance jurisdiction or cancelled. So I hope that's clear.
There are a couple more questions. A very quick one is, can you please delve into the Ekos carbon accreditation? And do you offer this on a product and project base or only at organizational level? And I can answer that very quickly. It can be on product level, organization level, or project level. I have just a few slides to finish off. An important announcement on our train journey, and that is to communicate your story to the world and stay credible. There are a few things to consider. One is you are transparent about it, and for example, like the Chia sisters, you put out what your emissions are, you do it by activity, be super transparent about it. So be open about your scope and publicly declare your emissions. Another important aspect is to show who's accountable and responsible in the organization. So CNALF in Australia, under the Climate Active program, have said here that George Mamek, the sales director, he's responsible for it. So it's very easy to identify those people. By the way, we also have a couple of our people currently on the pathway being accredited to help under the Climate Active program. So we can help there as well. Next one is again back to transparency. And I've put up an example of an EPD here because it shows you clearly who did the, in this case, EPD or carbon footprint. It shows you also very clearly what rules are used, where can you find the rules, so that it's a really transparent process. And lastly, it shows you who's the third-party verifier. And you can see we were on the measurement train, and then Arcelio changed over to the verification line to work with Andrew Moore. So it's two separate lines here on that they have been traveling towards us. And lastly, the cancellation, it really shows here where that has it pinned. So under the Market Environmental Registry in New York and London, this certain number of credits have been cancelled. So it really is, you need to prove that your credits have been eaten up. So just checking everything in order, like the conductor tickets, please. It's your emission report is available. You have an auditor assurance statement. Your methodology is based on international standards. Your methodology and rules are available for review, and you have proof for the cancellation. And if all that's the case, your tickets are valid and you can move towards zero carbon. So just a quick announcement, we have a next webinar planned for the 31st of March, and that is with Phil Tate, our colleague who's a trained futurist. It's about embracing extreme uncertainty to develop resilient action plans in light of COVID-19. So that's on the 31st of March. And after that, we'll have a few more planned. We'll announce the dates separately. We'll talk again with Sean about carbon, and with Jane Anderson, who's an international EPD expert, we will talk about EPDs. So see you at the next webinar. And for those of you interested in EPDs, we also have a quick announcement that we have recently launched our Think EPD website. And if you go there under resources, you will find very soon a recording of this webinar. And with that, Sean and I say thank you very much. Goodbye. See you next time. And a big thank you again to Sean.
Thanks, everyone. See you later, and thank you, Barbara.
Bye-bye, everyone.